Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey unlike any other, not through life, but through the most unforgettable exits in history. The kind of deaths that make you gasp, shake your head and say, did that really happen? From ancient warriors who chose flames over surrender, to inventors taken out by their own inventions, history's most epic deaths are often as poetic as they are tragic. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin with Mithridates VI, king, warrior, master of languages, and a man so paranoid he essentially turned himself into a living science experiment. Ruling the kingdom of Pontus in the 1st century BCE, Mithridates lived in constant fear of assassination, which, to be fair, was a pretty rational fear for ancient monarchs. Poison was the medieval espresso shot, quick, easy, and very much in fashion at royal dinner parties. So what did he do? He started microdosing everything that could kill him. Hemlock, a pinch, arsenic, a dash, belladonna, just a taste. Over time, he built up what was believed to be near-total immunity. His personal apothecaries even created a legendary antidote called the Mithridatium, a cure-all concoction so potent, medieval doctors were still trying to replicate it over 1,000 years later. This man didn't just eat food, he dared it to try anything. But then came Rome. They didn't care about his science project. Rome wanted Pontus, and after a series of bloody conflicts, Mithridates found himself cornered. Betrayed, surrounded, and facing capture, the proud king decided he wouldn't give his enemies the satisfaction of parading him through the streets of Rome in chains. He reached for the poison, his old faithful friend, and nothing. After years of carefully inoculating himself against death, he was, in fact, immune to dying, at least the quiet, elegant kind. Like a chef who couldn't be burned, or a fish who forgot how to drown, Mithridates had outplayed his own exit strategy. With Romans breaking down the gates, he turned to one of his mercenaries and essentially said, "All right, Plan B, do it manually." And just like that, the king who outsmarted poisons fell to a good old-fashioned sword thrust. Sometimes death doesn't need to be clever, just consistent. Mithridates went down in history as the man who couldn't be killed chemically, but could still be stabbed like everyone else. It's almost poetic, really. A reminder that no matter how well you plan, fate always keeps a rusty blade nearby, just in case. Our next tale begins with a Viking, and like all good Viking stories, it includes beheading, bravado, and dental revenge. Meet Sigurd Eysteinsson, also known as Sigurd the Mighty, a Norse earl ruling over the Orkney Islands in the 9th century. Fierce in battle, proud of his conquests, and apparently not one for subtlety. Sigurd had a bit of a rivalry with a Scottish noble named Maelbrigte the Buck-Toothed, which, yes, is a real nickname, and yes, it will become disturbingly relevant. Tired of the back and forth, Sigurd challenged Brigte to a battle, each bringing 40 men. But Sigurd, in true Viking fashion, cheated. He brought 80. The math was not in Brigte's favour. The result? Total massacre. Sigurd beheaded Brigte in the chaos, and, in a bold move that can only be described as extra, tied the severed head to his saddle as a trophy on his victory ride home. This is where things go south. As Sigurd galloped through the countryside, feeling like a war god, Brigte's head bumped along beside him, swinging against the horse, and as fate would have it, one of Brigte's famously large teeth scraped Sigurd's leg. Just a scratch. Nothing to worry about, right? Wrong. This was the 9th century. There were no antibiotics, no neosporin, not even a bandage. The wound became infected. Sigurd fell ill, and within days, he died. That's right. He was killed by the tooth of a man he had already beheaded. Bright didn't win the battle, but he definitely won the grudge match. It's the kind of story that feels like it belongs in a myth. A warrior punished for arrogance, felled by the smallest, most ironic detail. A literal bite from the past. And while Viking sagas are often filled with dramatic deaths, flaming ships, and curses from angry gods, few are as poetically absurd as this one. Sigurd rode home thinking he had won. Instead, he became the punchline in one of history's most bizarre obituaries. So let that be a lesson. Even in victory, check your saddle. And maybe don't strap enemy heads to your horse. You never know what teeth are plotting. Let's talk about Pyrrhus of Epirus, a man so good at winning battles that he lost entire wars just proving the point. This was no minor noble. Pyrrhus was the cousin of Alexander the Great, a military prodigy, and a persistent thorn in the side of Rome. He was known for Pyrrhic victories. That's when you technically win, but lose so much doing it that you might as well have stayed home and done laundry. After years of exhausting campaigns, heroic charges, and shouting at elephants to do what they were told, Pyrrhus ended up in Argos, trying to sort out yet another Greek political mess. It was late, he was tired, but honour and bad decisions demanded one more battle. So, in the dead of night, Pyrrhus led his troops into the city. But this wasn't a grand cinematic entrance. His elephants got stuck in narrow streets. His soldiers got lost. And by morning, Pyrrhus, the great general, was sword-fighting random enemies in an alley like a drunken tourist in armour. Now here's where fate sharpens its comedy pencil. Above the street, an elderly woman watched the chaos unfold from her rooftop. We don't know her name, but we do know this. She had opinions, and a roof tile. And she decided it was time to participate. With the casual accuracy of someone who had clearly thrown a few things before, probably at chickens, grandchildren, or other invading kings. She dropped the tile. Direct hit. The ceramic shingle clonked Pyrrhus on the head. He fell to the ground like a sack of old turnips. One of the enemy soldiers, either confused or opportunistic, rushed over and finished him off. Just like that, the man who survived Roman legions, Macedonian politics, and his own ego, was taken out by a Greek grandma and basic building supplies. No epic final duel. No glorious charge. Just a fatal encounter with bad roof maintenance. There's no statue for the woman. No official medal for best use of architectural debris in urban combat. But honestly, there should be. And Pyrrhus. He became a cautionary tale, a reminder that no matter how big your army is, gravity always wins. Next up is Grigory Rasputin, the Russian mystic, healer, and beard enthusiast, whose death has become the gold standard for overkill. Now, Rasputin was a problem, not just politically, but cosmically. He was like that one guy at a party who won't leave, won't stop talking about his spiritual visions, and has somehow hypnotized the host's wife and all her friends. Only in this case, the host was Tsarina Alexandra of Russia, and the party was a crumbling monarchy. Naturally, the Russian nobility wanted him gone. Politely at first, but Rasputin didn't do subtle. So they moved on to murder. Plan A. Poison. They baked him a cake and poured enough cyanide into it to take out a village. Rasputin ate it, smiled, and asked for more. At this point, someone probably started sweating, so they moved to Plan B, shoot him, which they did, in the chest. Rasputin dropped. Success. They leaned in to confirm. Bad move. He sat up like a horror movie villain and started yelling. This is the part where someone definitely screamed and dropped a glass. So, Plan C, shoot him again, multiple times. He went down again, but still not quite done. Rasputin then crawled across the floor, allegedly trying to flee the palace. Because why not? It's not like bullets had ever stopped him before. By now, the assassins were running out of ideas. So they bound him up, dragged him to the river, and threw him into the frozen Neva. You know, just to be thorough. And here's the final twist. When his body was found downstream, his hands were reportedly clawing at the ice, which implies he was still alive, underwater, trying to escape. Because of course he was. It took poison, gunfire, blunt force trauma, and drowning to finally end Rasputin. If they'd tried stabbing him with garlic or driving a stake through his heart, no one would have even blinked. So what do we learn here? Never underestimate a man with terrible hygiene, questionable theology, and skin apparently made of iron. Our next exit comes courtesy of Chrysippus of Soli, a Stoic philosopher from ancient Greece who spent his life contemplating logic, ethics, and, apparently, fig-eating livestock. Now, Stoic philosophers were known for their seriousness. They taught emotional restraint, rational thought, and enduring hardship with a stiff upper lip. But Chrysippus? He went out laughing. Literally. One afternoon, while doing whatever ancient philosophers did between lectures, likely pacing dramatically in a toga, Chrysippus noticed something odd. A donkey eating figs. That's it. That's the scene. But Chrysippus, clearly in a mood, turned to a servant and said, "Give that donkey a drink of wine to wash down the figs." And that's when it happened. He began to laugh. And he didn't stop. Not a polite chuckle. Not a philosopher's smirk. A full-blown, chest-rattling, wheezing, gasping, tears in the eyes laughing fit that ended in death. Yes, the man who could lecture for hours about the nature of the universe died. Because he thought a donkey eating fruit and sipping wine was too funny to live through. To be clear, this wasn't the first time ancient Greek philosophers died in bizarre ways. One supposedly choked on a fig, another fell into a well while stargazing. But Chrysippus truly committed to the bit. Imagine the scene. Scholars gathered around, ready for another lesson in virtue, only to find their teacher sprawled on the floor, still smiling, possibly mid-giggle. Not exactly the legacy Plato had in mind. There's something beautifully ironic about a Stoic, someone whose entire life was about controlling emotion, being undone by a single punchline. It's like if a fire safety instructor went out juggling matches near a curtain. And what a legacy. People might forget your theories on metaphysics, but the guy who died laughing at his own donkey joke? That'll be passed down for centuries. Some say laughter is the best medicine. In this case, it was definitely not. Let us now meet Franz Reichelt, a man of vision, a man of ambition, a man who thought, why should only birds have all the fun? Franz was an Austrian-born tailor living in Paris in the early 20th century. But he didn't just sew suits. He wanted to sew history. His idea? A wearable parachute. That's right. Franz dreamed of designing a coat that could transform into wings. Fashion meets aviation. Early aviation was still a mess at this point, with planes that looked like flying kites and crashes being more common than landings. So Franz figured, if pilots had to go down, at least they could glide down in style. After many attempts, tests and prototypes, most of which ended with crash dummies plummeting into the ground, Franz was ready. Or at least he thought he was. Despite friends and authorities begging him not to, he insisted on testing it himself. And what better stage for this dramatic debut than the Eiffel Tower? It was 1912. Franz arrived in full media flair, proudly wearing his flying coat. Reporters gathered, cameras rolled, even police were there, mostly hoping to stop him, but also somewhat curious. He climbed the tower, waved to the crowd, and stood on the ledge. And then he jumped. The parachute? It didn't open, not even a little. Franz fell straight down, like a tailor-shaped brick, and hit the ground at roughly, we don't measure speed in pain, miles per hour. He died instantly, leaving behind a crater, a twisted coat, and an uncomfortable silence among the spectators. It would have been a tragic end, if it weren't also so perfectly ironic. A man who tried to make falling safe by falling. He went out doing what he loved, inventing. Unfortunately, his final prototype also served as his final moment. And as cruel as history can be, it remembers him not as a tailor, not even as an inventor, but as the flying tailor, a man who aimed for the sky and made it to the ground instead. If you thought being a Roman emperor meant eternal glory, flowing togas, and grapes served on silver platters, let me introduce you to Valerian, the only Roman emperor who got captured in battle and then turned into furniture. Valerian ruled during the 3rd century CE, a time when the Roman Empire was cracking like an overcooked lasagna. Plagues, civil wars, barbarian invasions. It was bring your own chaos every year. Still, Valerian tried to hold it all together. One of his main challenges? The Persians, specifically a king named Shapur, who had absolutely no patience for Roman posturing. So Valerian gathered his army and marched east, determined to assert dominance. It did not go well. In the Battle of Edessa, the Roman army was obliterated, and Valerian was taken alive. A rarity back then. Capturing an emperor was like catching a unicorn in a bear trap. You'd think Shapur might ransom him or make a diplomatic power play. Nope. Shapur had a better idea. He used Valerian as a literal human footstool. That's right. Whenever Shapur mounted his horse, he had the former emperor brought out to kneel beneath his boots. Daily. Publicly. It's not just humiliation, it's humiliation with choreography. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, it did. After years of this royal degradation, Valerian died in captivity. How? The sources disagree, but the most colourful version says Shapur had him skinned, stuffed with straw, and displayed as a war trophy in a Persian temple. A warning to Rome. A triumph for Persia. And, let's be honest, a taxidermist's worst day on the job. Rome, of course, was not pleased. They never officially acknowledged Valerian's fate. They acted like he just sort of disappeared. Probably sipping wine in retirement, right? Sure. But Valerian's fate stuck in the historical memory. A mighty emperor brought down by hubris, bad strategy, and a king with a very literal sense of humour. Say hello to King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, a monarch remembered less for ruling a nation and more for losing a duel with his own dinner. Adolf Frederick reigned during the 18th century, a relatively peaceful time in Swedish history. He wasn't known for waging wars, passing sweeping reforms, or writing philosophical treatises. No, he's famous for eating himself to death, and not metaphorically. This was not a poetic, devoured by ambition situation. This was a literal death by buffet. It was Fat Tuesday 1771, the last day before Lent. A perfect excuse to indulge. And King Adolf did not hold back. According to historical accounts, he consumed lobster caviar sauerkraut, smoked herring champagne, and 14 servings of his favourite dessert, semla. Now, if you've never had a semla, imagine a cardamom-spiced bun filled with almond paste and whipped cream, floating in warm milk. Delicious, fluffy, deceptively innocent. Unless you eat them 14 times in a row, in which case, they become a Viking curse in pastry form. After this heroic effort, the king reportedly complained of stomach pains, which, let's be honest, is the politest way history could phrase what must have been a full-body rebellion. Shortly after, he died. Cause of death? Digestive problems, they said. In modern terms, we might file that under fatal food regret. Swedish citizens were understandably shocked. One minute you have a king, the next he's been outmaneuvered by a dessert. Not an assassin, not a rebellion, not a duel. Cream and almonds. There's something bizarrely poetic about it. A king, indulging himself one last time, taken out by the very luxury that defined his life. The royal court tried to keep it dignified. But history remembers the menu. To this day, Sweden still celebrates Fat Tuesday with semla buns. And yes, every year someone brings up the king who loved them a little too much. Let us now turn to Diogenes of Sinope, ancient Greece's most famous minimalist, social critic, and professional button pusher. Diogenes was a philosopher of the Cynic school, which is a polite way of saying he didn't care what anyone thought, wore the same tunic every day, and lived in what was essentially a giant clay jar. He believed in living a life free of possessions, social expectations, and personal shame, and he practiced what he preached, publicly, loudly, sometimes indecently. So how did this crusty legend meet his end? Well, ancient sources disagree, which is always a red flag in historical storytelling. But one of the most entertaining accounts claims that Diogenes died by holding his breath. Yes, voluntarily, as in, I'm done with the world. Let me just not inhale again. Some say it was an act of willpower, a final mic drop in a life dedicated to rejecting society. Others suspect he was just really stubborn and possibly trying to prove a point about controlling his own destiny. Now, to be fair, there are other reported causes of his death. One version says he died from eating raw octopus. Another claims he was bitten by a dog, which, given his love for canine metaphors, feels a little too poetic. But the breath-holding theory? That one stuck. Probably because it's just so Diogenes. This was a man who once walked through the streets at high noon with a lantern, claiming he was searching for an honest man. A guy who told Alexander the Great, the most powerful man on earth, to move aside because he was blocking the sun. So yes, choosing to stop breathing because you're simply done with people fits the brand. And the best part, people respected it. The same society he mocked, challenged, and rejected ended up honoring him with a public tomb. Turns out, being a curmudgeon with excellent one-liners gets you remembered. Diogenes died the way he lived, dramatically, weirdly, and completely on his own terms. Now we come to Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man so wealthy, he made other Roman millionaires feel like part-time pottery vendors. Crassus wasn't just rich, he was obscenely rich. He owned silver mines, real estate, slaves, fire brigades. Yes, he owned fire brigades, which he sent to burning buildings and offered to help if you sold him the property first. Real estate shark, Roman edition. But he wanted more, not just gold, glory. He'd already made money. Now he wanted to be remembered like Caesar or Pompey, the kind of man who conquered something larger than a tax loophole. So, in 53 BCE, Crassus decided to invade Parthia, Rome's wealthy eastern neighbor. Think of it as Rome's version of, "Hold my wine, I got this." It was a disaster. He underestimated the Parthians, who had terrifying archers, expert cavalry, and very little interest in being conquered. Crassus walked his army deep into the desert and right into a trap. Thousands of Roman soldiers were massacred. His son was killed. Morale collapsed faster than a Roman aqueduct during budget cuts. And eventually, Crassus was captured. Now, the Parthians knew who he was. They'd heard the legends. The richest man in Rome. A man obsessed with wealth. Practically a walking coin purse. So as a parting gift, they executed him by pouring molten gold down his throat. You read that correctly. The richest man in Rome died choking on liquid wealth. It was less an execution and more a performance piece. A brutal theatrical message. You wanted gold? Here, take it. All the way to your lungs. Some say it's myth. Others say it's exaggerated. But even if it wasn't exactly how he died, the story spread like wildfire across Rome. And that's the thing with history. Sometimes it prefers poetic justice over boring truth. Crassus's golden demise became a cautionary tale, not just about greed, but about hubris, about flying too close to the sun while holding a bag of coins. If you've ever heard the phrase, "I am Spartacus," know that behind the meme and movie moment lies a man who quite literally fought until no one was left standing, including himself. Spartacus wasn't born a hero. He was a Thracian soldier, captured by Romans, and tossed into the brutal, unforgiving world of gladiator schools, which were less Hogwarts for fighters, and more daily beatings with occasional bread. He trained, he survived, and then he rebelled. In 73 BCE, along with about 70 fellow gladiators, Spartacus escaped using kitchen knives and whatever else wasn't nailed down. Within weeks, They had defeated Roman patrols and gathered thousands of runaway slaves and outcasts. It became a movement, a full-blown slave uprising, right in the heart of Rome's pride. For 2 years, Spartacus led this rebel army. They defeated trained legions, embarrassed Roman generals, and caused panic in the Senate. And through it all, Spartacus refused to be treated like a footnote. He wasn't just escaping, he was fighting back. But the Romans, unsurprisingly, don't enjoy being humiliated for long. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus. Yes, molten gold throat Crassus from our last chapter, who was tasked with cleaning up the rebellion before it became a full revolution. Eventually, Spartacus and his army were cornered in southern Italy. Outnumbered, surrounded, supplies running low, no escape. But Spartacus didn't surrender. Instead, he did what Spartacus always did. He fought. According to ancient sources, he charged directly toward Crassus himself, slicing through soldiers like a man who had absolutely no interest in retiring quietly. He was wounded, reportedly stabbed multiple times, but kept fighting until he vanished in the crush of battle. His body was never found. No triumphal parade, no captured king on Roman steps. Just gone. And yet, his story endured. Rome crucified over 6,000 of his followers along the Appian Way as a warning. But they couldn't erase the fact that a man who started with kitchen knives had nearly broken their empire's pride. Spartacus didn't just die, he refused to fall. And that kind of ending leaves a louder echo than any emperor's throne. In the chaotic twilight of the Roman Republic, a time when senators plotted over wine and civil wars broke out during lunch breaks, one name flickers briefly before going out in spectacular fashion: Lucius Junius Brutus Damasippus. Now, Damasippus wasn't a household name, but he was a Roman general and a staunch supporter of Marius, one half of the infamous Marius v Sulla rivalry. Think of it as Rome's version of a political debate, except instead of microphones, everyone had swords and backup legions. When Sulla returned from the east with his battle-hardened army, Rome braced for impact. Damasippus, loyal to the now defeated Marians, was arrested during Sulla's brutal cleansing of his enemies, a political spring cleaning, except with significantly more blood and fewer dustpans. He was sentenced to execution, along with a handful of other high-profile prisoners. But here's where Damasippus earns his place in our list. As he and the others were being led to their deaths, one of the condemned men began sobbing, pleading for his life. Panicking, Damasippus turned to him and laughing said, "Why weep, fool? Did you not know what business we came here for?" And that was it. No grovelling, no final meal request, just a sardonic one-liner and a confident walk toward the blade. It's the kind of reaction that screams, "I've read the script and I don't need a rewrite." In an age when last words could be poetic, desperate, or full of regret, Damasippus chose dry sarcasm. He faced death like it was a dull committee meeting, mildly inconvenient, but nothing worth losing your dignity over. Was he a great general? Perhaps not. Did he change history? No. But he went out with more composure than most emperors, kings, or philosophers. And sometimes in history that's enough. He faced the end, not with fear, but with a shrug, a joke, and impeccable timing. If history had a most likely to be assassinated by lunchtime yearbook, Caligula would have been on the cover, in full laurel crown. Smiling, born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, he started out promising. The Roman people loved him, the army adored him. He was the son of a war hero, raised in the imperial palace, and for a brief moment in 37 CE, he looked like Rome's golden boy. Then, the cheese slid entirely off the cracker. Caligula's reign spiraled into a fever dream of paranoia, delusion, and performance art-level governance. He declared himself a god, demanded to be worshipped as such, and, famously, appointed his horse, Incitatus, as a senator. Now, to be fair, the horse never attended a session, but he had a marble stable, a jeweled collar, and, allegedly, better table manners than most of the Senate. Caligula executed senators for blinking suspiciously, made war declarations on Poseidon, yes, the sea god, and once ordered his army to collect seashells as war trophies. This wasn't just madness, it was creative madness. Eventually, even his closest guards got tired of dodging his daily whims. His behavior was unpredictable, his punishments theatrical, and Rome was tired of being ruled by a man who thought reality was optional. So, in 41 CE, a group of conspirators led by members of the Praetorian Guard, his own security detail, decided it was time for a performance of their own. They cornered him in a corridor beneath the palace. No speeches, no poetic farewells, just stabbing. Lots of it. One source says over 30 wounds were inflicted. That's not an assassination. That's a strongly worded group project. His body was dumped in a shallow grave. No honours, no state funeral, just the end of a man who once tried to replace statues of gods with statues of himself. And yet, Caligula is still remembered. Not for wisdom or reform, but for turning Rome into a circus and ruling it like a fever dream. He died as dramatically as he lived, surrounded by blades, betrayed by his own, and probably thinking, my horse could have run this place better. And, honestly, he might have been right. Few people in history have had a death as weirdly specific and wine-themed as George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence. Now, if the name rings a bell, it's because George was smack in the middle of England's messiest family feud, the Wars of the Roses. Think of it as a 15th century version of Game of Thrones, except with more velvet hats and fewer dragons. George was the younger brother of King Edward IV, and the older brother of Richard III. Yes, that Richard III. And for a time, George was right in line for the throne. Unfortunately, George had two fatal flaws: ambition and a complete lack of self-preservation. He switched sides in the Civil War more than once, plotting rebellions, aligning with whoever looked strongest that week, and making enemies faster than a medieval tax collector. Eventually, King Edward, tired of George's constant backstabbing, sometimes literal, had him arrested for treason. Now, Edward faced a problem. How do you execute your own brother without making it look like a PR nightmare? Enter the weirdest royal death solution in English history. According to chroniclers, George was given a choice in how he'd like to die, and he supposedly picked being drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. Let that sink in. Not gallows, not axe, not even a respectable poisoning. A wine barrel, full of it, as if he wanted his obituary to read, "Died doing what he loved." Was this poetic? Ironic? A joke that went too far? Historians still argue about whether it really happened or if it was a satirical flourish added later. But the image stuck. And honestly, even if it's exaggerated, it feels like something Clarence would have requested. Messy, extravagant, and mildly ridiculous. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, probably stone-cold sober by then, and largely forgotten except for the rather splashy nature of his demise. So if you ever feel like your family has drama, just remember, at least no one's been accused of treason, sentenced to death by wine barrel, and turned into England's most drinkable cautionary tale. Now that's a vintage ending. To close out our journey of legendary exits, we arrive at a tale that proves brilliance is no defense against bad timing. The death of Archimedes, the greatest mind of ancient Greece, tragically felled by a guy who did not care about geometry. Archimedes was a mathematician, engineer, inventor. Basically the kind of guy who could glance at a puddle and discover fluid mechanics. He invented levers, pulleys, war machines, and once reportedly defended the city of Syracuse with giant mirrors that reflected sunlight to set Roman ships on fire. Whether or not that last bit is true, the man was undeniably sharp. Unfortunately, what he wasn't was social. In 212 BCE, the Romans finally captured Syracuse after a long and brutal siege. Soldiers poured into the city, looting, shouting, searching for enemies. And there, on the ground, bent over a diagram in the sand, was Archimedes. He was sketching, deep in thought, probably working out some eternal truth about spirals or catapults or how many camels it takes to fill a bath. A Roman soldier approached. Now most people, upon seeing a man with a sword, might stand up, greet him, maybe say, "Please don't kill me." But not Archimedes. Legend says he simply looked up and said, "Do not disturb my circles." That was it. No plea, no introduction, just a firm boundary about his geometry. The soldier, either offended, confused, or simply not a fan of math, killed him on the spot. A casual, almost bureaucratic end to one of the greatest minds in history. When the Roman general Marcellus found out, he was furious. He'd given strict orders that Archimedes be spared. The man was too valuable, too brilliant to waste. But alas, brilliance is no match for a confused foot soldier and a bad attitude. There's a strange poetry in it. Archimedes, the man who calculated the volume of irregular shapes and invented the screw pump, felled not by a rival genius, but by someone who probably didn't even know what a hypotenuse was. And so, one of history's brightest lights was snuffed out, mid-equation. Let that be a lesson. If you're working on a big idea, maybe look up once in a while, especially during an invasion. Being royalty came with a lot of perks: velvet robes, bottomless feasts, a private choir or two. But as King Henry I of France learned in the 11th century, it didn't come with back support. Now, Henry wasn't particularly wild. He didn't ride into battle bare-chested or throw orgies in the throne room. He was a relatively steady ruler, which, in medieval Europe, made him practically a unicorn. He reigned from 1031 to 1060, dealt with some standard rebellions, raised a family, built a church here and there. Nothing too flashy. But he will forever be remembered not for what he ruled, but how he left. The story goes that one day, after sitting for a long time, perhaps in prayer, or more likely just after a really long royal meeting, King Henry stood up too quickly, and that was it. He collapsed. Possibly a stroke, possibly an aneurysm, possibly just gravity asserting dominance. Whatever it was, he died shortly afterward. To be fair, medicine in the 11th century wasn't exactly known for its diagnostic accuracy. The local physician probably waved some herbs over his chest, muttered something about bad humours, and recommended immediate bleeding. Spoiler, it didn't work. And thus, the King of France became one of the first recorded victims of what modern science might call orthostatic hypertension. That weird head rush you get when you stand up too fast and suddenly see stars. Only in his case, it wasn't just dizziness. It was the end credits. Now you might think that dying after standing up is a little too anticlimactic for a king. But consider the symbolism. A man who ruled for decades, made it through wars, plots, and plague, brought down by a swift change in posture. It's like history whispering, even kings aren't safe from leg cramps. In medieval Japan, where honor was often measured in sword strokes and dramatic exits, Sesshu Toyo chose a quieter legacy, one made of ink, silence, and extraordinary patience. Born in 1420, Sesshu was raised in a temple, trained as a Zen monk, and, like most monks, expected to follow a life of meditation, humility, and sweeping floors. Except Sesshu had a problem. He loved to draw. Constantly. Obsessively. Especially when he wasn't supposed to. There's even a famous story that as a child, when punished and tied up for neglecting his duties, he used his toe to draw a mouse on the floor so lifelike that the monks were reportedly startled. That's right. His detention doodles had jump scares. Sesshu later travelled to China to study ink painting at its source. He returned to Japan with a style so bold, fluid, and emotionally charged that it changed Japanese art forever. Landscapes that looked like they were breathed onto the page, mountains that seemed to hover in mist, trees with more personality than most dinner guests. He grew old, painting nature and emptiness, classic Zen themes. But unlike the samurai of his age, who often died dramatically in battle or ritual suicide, Sesshu simply kept painting. And when his time came, he faced death as he faced life, with a brush in hand. Legend says that as he lay dying in 1506, Sesshu asked for ink and paper. His final act? A single bold stroke, one last line on the page. Simple, intense, mysterious. No signature, no explanation, just a brushstroke to mark the exit, as if to say, this is enough. He didn't die in a sword fight. He didn't poison himself under a cherry tree. He simply painted until the end, and let the ink speak where words never could. A quiet death, but an epic one if you understand what it means to leave behind a masterpiece in silence. So, next time life feels loud, remember Sesshu. Sometimes the final word is just a line. If you've ever imagined a samurai death as noble, cinematic, and wrapped in cherry blossoms, Saigo Takamori is the man your imagination was borrowing from. Born in 1828, Saigo rose through the ranks as a brilliant warrior, statesman, and eventually a reluctant revolutionary. He helped lead the Meiji Restoration, which modernized Japan, abolished the feudal system, and unfortunately, made samurai about as useful as a fax machine in a smartphone world. Many samurai adapted. Saigo did not. As reforms swept through Japan, banning swords, samurai stipends, and everything else that rhymed with tradition, Saigo became the quiet face of discontent. And in 1877, when the Satsuma Rebellion ignited, he stood at the front. It was supposed to be a protest. It turned into a war. Saigo, with a few thousand die-hard warriors, marched against the Imperial Army, a force now armed with rifles, artillery, and significantly fewer nostalgic ideals. For months they fought, outnumbered, outgunned, undeniably doomed. And still, Saigo refused to retreat. Eventually, at the Battle of Shiroyama, the final stand came. Surrounded, wounded, and watching his army crumble, Saigo turned to his remaining men. What followed is still debated. Did he commit seppuku, the ritual suicide of a samurai? Or was he too injured and asked a loyal follower to end it quickly? Either way, he died with his sword beside him, facing the future he helped build, but no longer belonged to. Japan mourned him, then immediately made him a legend. The government that defeated him eventually pardoned him posthumously, raised statues in his honor, and began telling schoolchildren how noble he was, as if they'd never aimed cannons at him in the first place. Saigo became the perfect tragic symbol, the man who fought for honor in a world that had moved on. Sometimes, you don't need to win to become immortal. You just need to lose like a legend. Jesse James wasn't just an outlaw. He was the poster child for American rebellion, the guy with a pistol in one hand and a train schedule in the other. Born in 1847 in Missouri, Jesse James started out as a Confederate guerrilla fighter, robbing Union soldiers and burning things that didn't belong to him. After the war, he figured, why stop now? And upgraded from rebel to full-time legend, leading the James Younger gang on a decade-long crime spree of bank heists, stagecoach stick-ups, and train robberies across the American Midwest. To the newspapers, he was a hero. To the banks, a nightmare. To most lawmen, a walking target with a bounty big enough to cause trust issues in any friend group. Which brings us to Robert Ford, Jesse's so-called friend and gang member, who had recently been promised a pardon and a $10,000 reward for helping bring Jesse in. Dead or alive. In April 1882, Jesse James was hiding out in St. Joseph, Missouri, living under an alias. Robert Ford and his brother were staying with him, like roommates, but with more loaded weapons and fewer boundaries. On the morning of April 3rd, Jesse took off his guns, rare, and stepped up on a chair to dust a framed picture on the wall. A domestic moment. A little too peaceful. Ford took out his revolver, aimed at Jesse's back, and shot him in the head. Mid-sentence, mid-movement, mid-dusting. The legend of the Wild West fell from a chair with a household chore unfinished. which feels, somehow, both epic and incredibly mundane. Robert Ford expected to be hailed as a hero. Instead, he was widely despised. The public didn't love Jesse because he was good. They loved him because he was bold, and killing him like that? It wasn't brave, it was convenient. Jesse James died not in a blaze of gunfire or a dramatic shootout, but in his socks, betrayed by a man drinking his coffee. Sometimes history isn't a duel at high noon. Sometimes it's just someone who turned their back, and someone else who couldn't resist the reward. If you've never heard of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, just know this. He wore a top hat, built half of Victorian Britain, and had a name that sounded like it should come with its own locomotive. Born in 1806, Brunel was the kind of genius who sketched bridges during breakfast and casually redefined what an impossible project looked like. He built tunnels under rivers, suspension bridges over valleys, and trains that moved faster than common sense allowed. But his biggest dream? Ships. Big ones. Really big ones. In the mid-19th century, Brunel designed the SS Great Eastern, a steamship so massive it made other vessels look like bath toys. It was over 700 feet long, powered by both paddle wheels and a screw propeller, and designed to sail from England to Australia without refueling. It was also, unfortunately, cursed from the start. During its construction, workers died. Fires broke out. A launch attempt failed, twice. One man was literally glued inside a hull panel for days before being rescued. The ship was so heavy it had to be launched sideways, which sounds cool until you realize it almost flattened a warehouse. Brunel, already suffering from stress, chain-smoking cigars like they were oxygen, had a stroke during all of this. And not just anywhere, on the ship itself while watching a demonstration of a new engine room feature. Some say the stress killed him, others say it was the absurd weight of expectation. Either way, he died just days before the ship's maiden voyage in 1859. And here's the kicker. On that first journey, the ship exploded. A steam pipe ruptured. 6 people died. It survived the voyage, but the dream? Already cracked. Brunel's death wasn't as theatrical as a battlefield or betrayal, but it was poetic. He was undone by his own brilliance, pushing the limits of what humanity could build, and forgetting that physics and fate don't always cooperate. So, while most people are buried quietly, Brunel was effectively outlived by a floating skyscraper that nearly collapsed on top of his legacy. Still, bridges stand, tunnels hold, and the hat, iconic. Sometimes the most epic deaths happen when you dream a little too big, and reality doesn't blink. Cleopatra Selene II was born into a world ablaze with ambition, myth, and political warfare. Her mother was Cleopatra VII, last pharaoh of Egypt, who styled herself as the living goddess Isis. Her father was Mark Antony, Rome's famed general, a man torn between loyalty to the Republic and his love for Egypt's queen. From the moment of her birth in 40 BCE, Selene was more than just a child. She was a symbol, a living promise that Egypt and Rome could rule together, not as rivals, but as partners. She was born in Alexandria, the city of wonders. Imagine growing up under marble colonnades and towering obelisks, where priests chanted in ancient tongues and philosophers argued under star maps. The Library of Alexandria was still breathing, the cult of Isis still powerful. Selene, along with her twin brother Alexander Helios, received a royal education: Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, and Roman politics. She learned to walk a line few could even see. But despite the incense and ceremony, she was also born into a political trap. Cleopatra and Antony had carved up the Eastern Mediterranean like a wedding cake, giving their children grand titles they had no real armies to back. Little Selene was crowned Queen of Cyrenaica and Libya before she could even speak. Her name meant moon, twin to her brother's sun. But the moon would soon have to learn how to survive in darkness. Back in Rome, Octavian, later Augustus, watched all of this with cold calculation. Antony's alliance with Cleopatra was more than scandalous. It was treasonous. When war broke out between Octavian and Antony, Selene's fate was sealed by adult choices she had no control over. At just 10 years old, she watched her world unravel. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE ended in crushing defeat for her parents. Her father took his own life. Her mother followed, famously choosing a cobra's bite over a Roman parade. And then, everything changed. Selene, once cradled in gold, was now a prisoner. Orphaned. Captive of the very man who had destroyed her family. But she didn't scream. She didn't collapse. History doesn't give us her words, but it does show us her next move. She did what few royal children did in the wake of catastrophe. She survived. And that was only the beginning. After the dust of Alexandria settled, Cleopatra Selene, barely 10 years old, was taken across the Mediterranean as a war trophy. She arrived in Rome not as a princess, but as a symbol of Octavian's triumph. She and her brothers were paraded through the streets in a chilling spectacle. The children of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, now orphans, dressed in chains of gold, walking in the shadow of the man who had crushed their dynasty. Imagine that for a moment. The daughter of gods paraded like loot. The same streets where Julius Caesar had once been hailed were now her stage of humiliation. But Selene didn't cry. No records speak of weeping or rebellion. Instead, the Roman crowd, expecting a sobbing child, saw a young girl who carried herself with eerie poise. Some even say the crowd pitied her. And in Rome, pity could be more powerful than fear. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, wasn't stupid. Killing the children of Antony and Cleopatra would stain his carefully crafted image of mercy and civilization. So he handed them over to his sister, Octavia, who also happened to be Antony's former wife. A cruel twist? Certainly. But it turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Under Octavia's roof, Selene was given education, protection, and, surprisingly, a second chance. The woman whose marriage Antony had betrayed now became Selene's guardian. Octavia wasn't just a political figure. She was known for her grace and restraint, and she saw to it that Selene was raised with Roman discipline, Greek intellect, and just enough Egyptian dignity to remind everyone whose daughter she was. Here, in the heart of Rome, the young queen-in-waiting observed. She studied the politics of survival. She learned when to speak and when silence could be a weapon. She mastered Latin, studied rhetoric, and read the myths of a people who had destroyed her lineage. She saw how Roman women moved through power, not with crowns, but through marriage, influence, and cunning. While her brothers faded into obscurity, Selene adapted. She didn't fight Rome with swords. She fought it by understanding it. She learned that survival meant becoming indispensable to the system that once tried to erase her. In public, she was a ward, a Romanized princess. But behind those calculating eyes was a girl quietly plotting her return to the world stage. Not in rebellion, but through something far more dangerous. Marriage. Cleopatra Selene's transformation from captive to queen did not come by force. It came through strategy. As she entered her teenage years, Rome was reshaping the world in its image, and client kings were being installed like chess pieces across its vast empire. Augustus, ever the political puppet master, saw in Selene both a threat and an opportunity. So, he made a calculated move. He married her off. Her husband was King Juba II of Mauritania, a scholar king raised in Rome himself. He was the son of a North African ruler who had sided with Julius Caesar, then lost everything when Caesar died. Like Selene, Juba had been paraded as a child captive and raised in the house of Octavia. He was intelligent, well-mannered, and Roman to the bone. In essence, he was a safe investment for Augustus, a king loyal to Rome, but foreign enough to rule its distant provinces. The marriage was more than a union. It was a diplomatic masterpiece. Two royal children of conquered empires, both brought to Rome as trophies, now paired together as rulers of a kingdom they didn't ask for. And yet, it worked. Serene became Queen of Mauritania, modern-day Algeria and Morocco, a land rich in culture but politically unstable. And she ruled not as a puppet, but as a monarch with vision. Together, Selene and Juba transformed their capital city, Iol, renaming it Caesarea in honor of Augustus. But it wasn't just a name change. Under Selene's influence, the city bloomed into a vibrant blend of Egyptian opulence, Greek art, and Roman engineering. Temples rose, libraries were built, coins were minted bearing her image, wearing the solar crown of Egyptian royalty, subtle perhaps, but a powerful nod to her ancestry. Selene wasn't just playing queen, she was leaving her mark on an entire region. While Juba focused on diplomacy and writing, he fancied himself a historian and geographer. Selena brought statecraft. She managed trade, patronized the arts, and infused the kingdom with a hybrid identity that was unmistakably her own. Here, far from Rome's shadow and Alexandria's ruins, Cleopatra Selene didn't just survive, she thrived. Her life, once shattered by politics and bloodshed, had become something rare in the ancient world, a tale of quiet reclamation. She was no longer a symbol. She was a sovereign, and she wasn't finished yet. Cleopatra Selene was not content to be a ceremonial figure or a quiet consort to Juba II. She had been born into empire, tutored by tragedy and sharpened by humiliation. Now, with a throne beneath her and a kingdom at stake, she brought forth something Rome had never quite seen, a queen who blended three civilizations into one vision. Mauritania had always been a cultural crossroads. Berber tribes, Phoenician traders, and Carthaginian ghosts haunted its coasts. But under Selene, this mosaic became deliberate. She didn't impose Egyptian dominance, nor did she bow entirely to Roman tastes. Instead, she fused them, cleverly and intentionally. She oversaw the building of massive public works, harbours, temples, markets. Roman aqueducts snaked through cities that echoed with Egyptian symbolism. Statues of Isis stood near Roman forums. Greek theatres thrived alongside African-style craftsmanship. The result wasn't confusion, it was harmony. A kingdom that felt ancient and modern at once, loyal to Rome, but uniquely its own. And through it all, Selene remained visible. This was rare for a queen in a client kingdom. She appeared on coins, not behind her husband, but beside him, wearing royal regalia that harkened back to Ptolemaic queens. The solar disk, the vulture crown, symbols of divine rulership. These were quiet declarations. Egypt may have fallen, but its lineage breathed through her veins. More than anything, Selene understood diplomacy as art. She played Rome's game, but didn't let it consume her. She hosted emissaries, managed grain exports, and reportedly had a hand in the kingdom's taxation policies, especially in cultivating wealth through trade with the Mediterranean. Mauritania, under her watch, became a valuable Roman ally, not because it bowed low, but because it worked efficiently and profitably. And while Rome's upper classes whispered of her exotic bloodline and the legacy of her infamous mother, Selene gave them nothing scandalous to pounce on. No affairs, no uprisings, just progress, balance, and quiet dominance. Yet, even in her success, the memory of Alexandria lingered. The collapse of her dynasty, the cobra in the basket, her father's sword, it never left her. But instead of reviving that fallen legacy, she encoded it into her rule. Her kingdom became a sanctuary of synthesis. She did not rebuild Egypt. She reimagined it, thousands of miles away, on Berber soil. And in doing so, she made Mauritania a dynasty of her own. Cleopatra Selene had always lived in the in-between. She was Egyptian by blood, Roman by upbringing, and now North African by throne. Yet rather than choosing one identity, she mastered all three. She was a daughter of Isis, but also a Roman matron. a Hellenistic intellectual, but a ruler of desert tribes. In every role she played, she was both, and more. But this duality wasn't just a clever trick of politics. It was survival. Selene knew what happened to women who leaned too far into ambition. Her mother had done so, and died as a villain in Roman eyes. She knew Rome admired docility in its queens, not daring. So she walked a tightrope, always regal, always composed. She didn't court scandal. She courted influence. One of her sharpest tools was symbolism. On Mauritanian coins, her image was more than decorative. She revived the solar crown of the Egyptian pharaohs and paired it with Roman styles. Laurel wreaths, togas, Latin inscriptions. These coins circulated across Africa and the Mediterranean, quietly reminding traders, nobles, and Roman officials alike the blood of Cleopatra still ruled, and her influence went beyond aesthetics. Selene encouraged religious fusion. The cult of Isis was permitted to flourish in Mauritania, but so were Roman deities like Jupiter and African spirits local to the region. This wasn't religious tolerance, it was political cohesion. She understood what Augustus had done in Rome, unite a diverse people through a shared pantheon. Now she did the same, subtly, in her own kingdom. Yet for all her elegance and poise, Selene was never just a background figure to her husband. Contemporary accounts and archaeological evidence suggest she played a crucial role in court decisions. Some historians believe she even governed in Juba's absence, issuing edicts, managing grain fleets, and settling tribal disputes. She wasn't just a queen. She was a partner in power. And perhaps most remarkably, she did all this without war. Cleopatra Selene's reign was defined by stability, something rare in the ancient world, and even rarer for a woman of her lineage. She didn't need to conquer lands. She conquered imaginations. In Rome, she had once been paraded as a prize. Now, she was a sovereign whose name commanded respect from senators and merchants alike. Not through fear, but through intelligence. A queen who had every reason to burn with vengeance, yet chose strategy instead. As Cleopatra Selene II settled into her role as Queen of Mauritania, her most lasting legacy began to take shape, not in marble or coin, but in the form of her son, Ptolemy of Mauritania. Born into this carefully balanced dynasty, Ptolemy was the final thread of a once glorious bloodline that stretched from Macedonian conquerors to Egyptian gods. Through him, Selene hoped to secure the continuity of everything she had rebuilt from ruin. She raised him not merely as a prince, but as a living synthesis of empire. Ptolemy's education was elite, befitting someone with blood ties to both Julius Caesar and the Ptolemies. He learned Latin law, Greek philosophy, and Egyptian religious customs. And most importantly, he learned diplomacy from the best possible teacher, his mother. Selene likely saw herself in the boy. Like her, he was born into a political chess game. Like her, he would have to survive in a world where lineage could be both a crown and a curse. But unlike her, Ptolemy had the benefit of stability, of growing up in a kingdom his mother had already molded into a sanctuary of balance. Yet Selene wasn't naive. She had seen how quickly dynasties fall when heirs grow soft or reckless, so she prepared him. Not with swords, but with the tools of negotiation, politics, and culture. She ensured he would be fluent in the languages of power, literally and figuratively. But perhaps most fascinating is that Selene never tried to resurrect Egypt through her son. She knew better. The world had changed. Augustus ruled with iron control, and any attempt to revive old claims would be crushed. Instead, she quietly embedded Egypt into Mauritania's soul through temples, imagery, customs, and passed that subtle legacy to Ptolemy. Her plan worked, at least for a time. Ptolemy eventually succeeded his father and ruled as king in his own right. Rome tolerated him, respected him, even granted him honorary consulship. He was treated like a prince of the blood, because that's exactly what he was. Through Ptolemy, Selene had done what her parents couldn't. She ensured the survival of their line without bloodshed. Her child wasn't a symbol of defeat, but of adaptation. and through him, her silent empire endured just a little longer. History often favors the loud, the conquerors, the revolutionaries, the mad emperors. But Cleopatra Selina left her legacy in whispers. No dramatic speeches survive, no scrolls filled with her philosophies. And yet, her fingerprints are everywhere, in the coins, the cities, the policies, and the quiet survival of a once doomed dynasty. As she entered the later years of her reign, Selene faded from Roman records. Some historians interpret this silence as political erasure. Others believe it was by her design. After all, visibility in Rome came with a price, especially for a woman with her ancestry. Perhaps she preferred to rule from the shadows, effective, invisible, and untouched by scandal. There are no records of scandal in her life. No betrayals, no affairs, no executions ordered in passion. That, in itself, is remarkable. Selene navigated a world defined by male egos, shifting alliances and cultural prejudice without once giving her enemies a foothold. She understood power not as something to flash, but to wield subtly. And perhaps that subtlety was her revenge. One of her most powerful acts may have been the absence of vengeance. Unlike her mother, she never sought to reclaim Egypt. She didn't challenge Augustus or agitate against Rome. Instead, she ensured that her people, those who had followed her from Alexandria or remembered the old gods, were given refuge in her hybrid kingdom. Archaeological findings suggest Mauritania, under her reign, saw a fusion of religious practices. Egyptian funerary art found alongside Roman mosaics, North African shrines dedicated to Isis nestled beside altars to Jupiter. It was a spiritual mosaic held together by her quiet hand. Even the capital city, Caesarea, bore her influence. While named after Augustus, its soul reflected her. Public works flourished, architecture carried Hellenistic elegance, and local crafts were elevated to state-sponsored prestige. She wasn't rebuilding Alexandria. She was outgrowing it. And yet, there was always the memory of her mother, glorified and vilified, of her father, disgraced and fallen, of a city lost, a dynasty ended, and a bloodline nearly erased. Selene didn't speak of these things. History doesn't give her voice, but she didn't need to. Her silence was a language of its own. Every policy she made, every temple she funded, every symbol she wore was a sentence in an unwritten memoir. The world forgot her words, but it remembered her results. And then, she was gone. Cleopatra Selene II, queen, daughter of two legends, ruler of a kingdom crafted in cultural gold, simply disappears from the record. No triumphant obituary, no preserved tomb. No Roman historian thought her final days worth documenting. For someone born amid fireworks of history, her end came like a fading candle. We can estimate her death around 5 BCE, based on the abrupt absence of her name from official documents and coinage. One day she was co-ruling Mauritania. The next, only Juba II appeared on the currency. No fanfare, no funeral inscription, just silence. But that silence is telling. In ancient royal circles, a quiet exit often meant one of two things. Either she died naturally and was mourned in private, or someone had reasons to erase her. And considering the political tightrope she walked for decades, both are possible. Still, there's no hint of scandal. Juba continued to rule after her death, but Mauritania never shone as brightly again. He married again, to Glaphyra, a Cappadocian princess. But that marriage ended quickly, and with far less legacy. Juba wrote books, governed dutifully, but something about the realm seemed dimmer. Selene, it seemed, had been more than queen. She had been the soul of the court. Her son Ptolemy took on the mantle after his parents, but even he would meet a tragic end, executed in Rome by Emperor Caligula decades later, for reasons still debated. With him, Cleopatra Selene's bloodline truly ended, and yet her fingerprints remained. Coins bearing her crowned image continued to circulate. Egyptian cults she had supported lived on in North Africa for centuries. The cities she shaped, like Caesarea, became hubs of trade and learning under Roman rule. Her legacy endured, not in thunderclaps, but in the long, slow turning of civilization. She had no epic tomb, but she built a kingdom. She left no famous speeches, but her policies changed lives. She raised no armies, but she conquered the chaos left by her parents and turned it into order. Cleopatra Selene vanished from the page, but only because she had already etched herself into the fabric of empire. And maybe that was her final act of brilliance, to vanish not as a victim of history, but as its architect. Cleopatra Selene II may have died in silence, but her story didn't end there. Her legacy lived on through her son, Ptolemy of Mauritania, a prince who embodied centuries of ambition, myth, and survival. He was the last known descendant of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the final living echo of Alexander the Great's generals and Egyptian pharaohs. Raised in the polished world his mother helped build, Ptolemy inherited not just a kingdom, but a delicate political legacy. He was young, wealthy, and Romanized, fluent in Greek, Latin, and diplomacy. His reign in Mauritania, though not as transformative as his mother's, was marked by continued prosperity and loyalty to Rome. But he walked a dangerous line, a client king with royal blood too grand for Rome to ignore. Initially, he played his role well. Augustus had granted him the rank of Roman senator, and later emperors welcomed him at court. He was praised for his wealth, his generosity, and his elegant lifestyle. The man wore purple, as was his right, and dined with emperors. But with every nod of favour came a whisper of envy. Ptolemy had what many Roman nobles feared, ancient legitimacy. And Rome, especially under unstable rulers, never trusted legacy. His downfall came under Caligula, the notoriously erratic emperor. Ptolemy visited Rome around 40 CE, reportedly dressed in regal splendor, perhaps too much for Caligula's fragile ego. According to ancient sources, Caligula said, "There is only room for one king in Rome." Soon after, Ptolemy was executed. No trial, no war, just sudden erasure. With his death, the dynasty of Cleopatra, of Alexander, of Isis herself, was finally extinguished. The bloodline that once ruled the most learned city on earth ended not with a battle or rebellion, but a paranoid emperor's whim. But Ptolemy's death, like his mother's, didn't erase their influence. Mauritania was annexed and reorganized into a Roman province, but it carried the blueprint Selene had drawn: cities, temples, hybrid traditions. Even in death she shaped the land. And though Rome tried to bury the dynasty, it never quite succeeded. The Ptolemies became myth. Cleopatra Selene, once paraded as a spoil of war, had outlived her enemies through legacy, culture, and her son's brief but glittering flame. The last Ptolemy fell, but the world he inherited still bore her name, her symbols, and her silent strength. Before the age of printed books, before the ink-drenched scrolls of Alexandria, there was clay, cold, heavy, and oddly eternal. And atop that clay, scratched in cuneiform, sat the earliest known library in human history, built by a king who wanted to be remembered not for conquest, but for knowledge. Welcome to Nineveh. The year is around 650 BCE. The king is Ashurbanipal, ruler of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and self-proclaimed king of the world. But unlike most rulers of his time, Ashurbanipal wasn't satisfied with temples and war trophies. He wanted something more profound, a vault for all human wisdom. In the heart of his palace complex, he ordered the creation of a massive repository of knowledge. The library of Ashurbanipal was no mere storage closet. It was a deliberate project to collect, organize, and protect the intellectual heritage of Mesopotamia. And by collect, we mean confiscate, copy, and catalogue. Royal agents were dispatched across the empire, demanding texts from priests, scholars, and scribes. By the time the library neared completion, it held over 30,000 clay tablets. Medicine, astrology, religious rituals, royal decrees, legal codes, dictionaries, even love poems and exorcism instructions. And among them sat the oldest known version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, inscribed in careful lines on baked clay. Each tablet was labelled and categorized, shelved in separate rooms by genre and function. Ashurbanipal's library even included a primitive referencing system, labels etched into the tablets noting where each text belonged. You could call it a proto-catalogue, long before librarians invented card systems. And Ashurbanipal, he read them, or at least claimed to. Unlike most kings, he boasted of being literate in Sumerian and Akkadian, languages already ancient in his time. His inscriptions declare, "I have read the cunningly written tablets of Sumer and the obscure Akkadian language which is hard to master." But this treasure trove wouldn't last. When Nineveh fell to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes in 612 BCE, the palace was burned to the ground. Ironically, that fire preserved many tablets by baking them hard, locking their texts in time. Thousands of years later, archaeologists unearthed the scorched remains. And in that silence, they found a king's dream, a clay time capsule of human memory, stubbornly refusing to disappear. While Assyria carved knowledge into clay, the Egyptians etched their wisdom into something far more elegant, papyrus. And with it, they built some of the world's earliest literary sanctuaries, the House of Life, a fusion of temple, scriptorium, and archive. These weren't public libraries in the modern sense, but sacred spaces where priests, scribes, and scholars safeguarded the secrets of civilization. Located in major temple complexes like Abydos, Thebes, and Edfu, the House of Life was considered a living institution, intimately tied to the gods, especially Thoth, the deity of wisdom, writing, and magic. Inside, scribes meticulously copied texts by hand, mythological hymns, funerary spells, astronomical records, medical manuals, legal documents, and administrative rolls. Each scroll was believed to carry not just words, but divine power. The work was slow, repetitive, and sacred. Scribes were trained from childhood in the art of hieroglyphs and hieratic script. A mistake wasn't just a scribal error, it was a spiritual failure, and papyrus, fragile and precious, could only be stored in dry, carefully managed conditions. Scrolls were kept in wooden boxes or in ceramic jars, labelled with string and tags. Each House of Life had its own classification system, although none survive in full detail. Perhaps the most famous example was at Perank in Thebes, where royal medical texts were copied and preserved for generations. It's likely where the Ebers Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical treatise filled with remedies, incantations, and surgical guidance, was produced and transmitted. But access to these libraries was highly restricted. They were not places of public enlightenment, but elite workshops for priests and royal advisors. Knowledge in Egypt was power, and power was guarded jealously. What you knew could determine your social rank, your religious role, or your fate in the afterlife, especially when your knowledge included spells from the Book of the Dead. And yet, these institutions served as bridges, linking one generation of scribes to the next, preserving Egypt's cultural identity through conquest, drought, and dynastic change. When invaders came, Persians, Greeks, Romans, the houses of life faded. Their scrolls vanished, burned, or rotted, but fragments survive in tombs, buried with mummies, or scattered through trade. Whispered in ink on brittle papyrus, ancient Egypt's wisdom didn't vanish entirely. It just slipped between the cracks of history, waiting to be unrolled. Long before modern catalogues, Babylon had its own information empire, one built on bricks, stars, and divine order. While Ashurbanipal's library was the most famous, Babylon's own centers of learning stretched across temples, ziggurats, and royal courts. Here, libraries weren't just collections of texts. They were cosmological blueprints, storing the secrets of gods, calendars, and kings. At the heart of Babylon's scholarly life were the temples of Esagila and Isidra, home to priest-scholars known as Umanu. These men weren't just scribes, they were mathematicians, astronomers, healers, and astrologers, and their libraries were compact, durable, and incredibly specific. Clay tablets filled with lists, omens, rituals, and calculations were carefully stacked in clay jars or pigeonholed into walls like ancient filing cabinets. One of the most remarkable Babylonian contributions was the Enuma Anu Enlil, a vast collection of celestial omens. It recorded thousands of years of star and planet observations, linked with predictions about war, plague, or prosperity. These texts weren't simply academic. They were consulted before royal decisions, battles, and even coronations. In a world ruled by signs, these tablets were oracles. And Babylon didn't stop with astronomy. Their libraries contained mathematical texts that demonstrate complex geometry and early algebra. The Plimpton 322 tablet, for instance, contains trigonometric calculations that predate Greek mathematics by over 1,000 years. To modern scholars, it reads like the rough draft of a calculus textbook. Babylonian scribes used a system of colophons, tiny notes at the end of tablets, that told you the scribe's name, the source, and sometimes warnings against stealing or misusing the knowledge. These weren't just records. They were intellectual property claims in the ancient world. But as Babylon passed from one conqueror to another, Hittites, Persians, Greeks, the libraries fell into decline. Many tablets were looted or broken, their fragments scattered in layers of rubble beneath centuries of dust. The dry climate preserved some, but most were buried and forgotten, until the 19th century excavations unearthed thousands of them. Even broken, these tablets spoke. In pieces no bigger than a palm, they held recipes, laws, spells, and the motions of stars. They proved that long before Aristotle or Euclid, the people of Mesopotamia had built a knowledge system both practical and poetic. Babylon's shelves may have crumbled, but its clay voices still whisper from the ruins. If knowledge had a capital in the ancient world, it was Alexandria. Founded by Alexander the Great and ruled by his successors, the Ptolemies, this Egyptian-Greek city became the beacon of ancient scholarship, and its heart was the great library of Alexandria. Built in the 3rd century BCE within the temple complex known as the Mouseion, a sanctuary for the Muses, the Library of Alexandria was more than a building. It was a dream, to collect every book, scroll, and scrap of knowledge the world had to offer. It wasn't a quiet room for local scholars. It was an intellectual empire. Under kings like Ptolemy the Pham and Ptolemy II, agents were sent across the Mediterranean to buy or copy scrolls from every port. Ships that docked in Alexandria were searched, and any scrolls on board were seized, copied, and stored. Even foreign works, Hebrew scriptures, Indian treatises, Babylonian astronomy, were translated into Greek. Estimates suggest the library may have held between 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls. These covered philosophy, medicine, engineering, poetry, botany, history, everything. Homer's works were edited here. Archimedes' ideas passed through its walls. Even Eratosthenes, the librarian, used it to calculate the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. The library wasn't just about collection, it was about correction. Scholars here compared versions of texts, identified errors, and created the earliest critical editions. They preserved the best and questioned the rest. But Alexandria's brilliance also made it fragile. Fires, wars, and politics chipped away at its scroll-stuffed shelves. The first major blow may have come in 48 BCE, when Julius Caesar's forces, trapped in Alexandria's harbour, set fire to enemy ships and accidentally ignited parts of the library complex. Later, as the Roman Empire solidified, Alexandria became a battleground of ideologies: pagan, Christian, Gnostic, and its library suffered. By the time of the Muslim conquest in 642 CE, it's unclear what remained. Some sources claim Caliph Umar ordered its destruction, saying, if the books agree with the Quran, they're redundant. If not, they're heretical. But historians debate whether the library had already vanished centuries before. What's certain is this: the Great Library is gone. Not a single scroll survives, and yet its legend persists, proof that the idea of a universal library was too powerful to burn completely. Alexandria became a symbol of what humanity once had, and tragically, what it lost. While Alexandria basked in fame, another city was quietly building a rival library, one that would challenge its dominance and revolutionize the very material of writing. That city was Pergamon, located in what is now modern-day Turkey. Under the rule of the Attalid dynasty in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, Pergamon became a cultural powerhouse, and at its center stood the Library of Pergamon. Founded by King Eumenes II, the library was said to house over 200,000 scrolls, making it second only to Alexandria. But it wasn't just about the numbers. Pergamon emphasized quality, carefully curated texts, pristine organization, and a scholarly environment that nurtured philosophical thought, medical advancement, and historical documentation. And it had one critical advantage: parchment. Legend has it that when the Ptolemies of Egypt heard of Pergamon's rise, they banned the export of papyrus to starve their rival of writing material. Pergamon responded by refining the use of animal skin, pergamenum, or parchment. This wasn't entirely new, but Pergamon's scribes elevated it into a durable, reusable, and smoother surface, more resistant to moisture than papyrus. This technological leap changed everything. Scrolls became sturdier, longer lasting, and eventually more portable. It was a pivotal moment in the evolution from scroll to codex, the precursor of the modern book. The Library of Pergamon wasn't just a depository, it was a scholarly hive. It attracted philosophers of the Stoic and Peripatetic schools and supported advances in medicine, including early surgical studies. Galen, one of antiquity's most famous physicians, was born in Pergamon and may have studied texts from the library itself. The competition between Pergamon and Alexandria created a kind of intellectual arms race. Scholars were lured with salaries, housing, and prestige. Rulers became patrons of erudition, and cities competed not in war, but in wisdom. It was, for a brief time, a golden age of collection and conservation. Eventually, Pergamon's scrolls would meet a strange fate. When Mark Antony married Cleopatra, he reportedly gifted Pergamon's library, scrolls and all, to Alexandria as a gesture of love. Whether this tale is truth or myth, it symbolizes how closely tied these repositories of wisdom were to power, empire, and romance. Though Pergamon's library no longer stands, its legacy lives on in every bound book. Its parchment outlasted empires. Its scrolls may have been lost, but its innovations rewrote history, literally. While the Mediterranean world was trading scrolls and perfecting parchment, across the globe, ancient China was building its own literary empire, one rooted not in myth or firelight, but in bureaucracy, history, and an unwavering respect for the written word. The libraries of the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, weren't just storehouses of knowledge. They were instruments of government, identity, and order. The Han emperors understood something vital. Whoever controls the records controls the narrative. So they created an imperial effort to collect, copy, and standardize texts. This was not just about preserving classics, it was about shaping culture. Confucianism had become the state ideology, and its foundational texts, like the Analects, Book of Rites, and Book of Documents, were meticulously curated and enshrined in imperial libraries. The most notable of these was the Imperial Library at Chang'an, the Han capital. Unlike the Library of Alexandria, it was not open to wandering scholars. It was a state archive, overseen by court historians, scholars, and scribes. Within its walls were not only literary works, but also census records, astronomical observations, maps, legal codes, and genealogies. Every stroke of ink on bamboo strips or silk scrolls was backed by the weight of empire. One of the most influential librarians in history emerged from this system. Liu Xiang, a Han scholar tasked with organizing the imperial collection. He didn't just catalogue books, he edited and annotated them, often deciding which versions of texts would survive. His son, Liu Xin, continued the work and developed one of the earliest classification systems, grouping texts into 6 major categories: classics, philosophy, poetry, warfare, medicine, and divination. These efforts were not without risk. During the preceding Qin dynasty, the infamous burning of books and burying of scholars had wiped out thousands of ancient works. The Han knew the stakes. Their libraries were an act of recovery, a cultural resurrection from ashes. But the format was fragile. Early texts were written on bamboo slips tied together with string, vulnerable to fire, mold, and time. Others were inked onto silk, delicate and costly. Still, thanks to the Han, a great portion of China's classical heritage was salvaged. The imperial libraries were less mythologized than Alexandria, but in practice, they may have preserved far more. In China, the pen didn't just rival the sword, it archived it. As Buddhism spread across Asia, so did something else: libraries. Temples became more than places of prayer. They evolved into archives of thought, havens of scholarship, and fortresses of fragile wisdom. From India to China, Tibet to Japan, the Buddhist world built repositories that treated books not as tools, but as sacred objects. The tradition began in India, where early Buddhist texts, sutras, were memorized orally by monks. But as the canon expanded, so did the need to write it down. Palm leaf manuscripts were inscribed in ink, tied with string, and wrapped in silk or cloth. The monasteries that housed these texts weren't just spiritual centers, they were the ancient world's safe houses for learning. In Nalanda, a massive monastic university founded in the 5th century CE, thousands of monks studied and copied texts on philosophy, logic, medicine, astronomy, and language. Nalanda's library was said to hold hundreds of thousands of volumes. According to tradition, it was divided into 3 buildings: Ratnasagara, Ocean of Jewels; Ratnadadi, Sea of Jewels; and Ratnaranjaka, Delight of Jewels, each housing increasingly rare and sacred works. Nalanda's library burned for months when it was destroyed by invading forces in the 12th century. The flames didn't just consume paper, they devoured generations of thought, debate, and spiritual insight. Meanwhile, in Tibet, Buddhist libraries took on an even more mystical role. Texts were often engraved onto wooden printing blocks or preserved in hand-copied manuscripts. Entire rooms were filled with kangyur, the Buddha's words, and tengyur, commentaries, wrapped in cloth and stored horizontally in shelves built into monastery walls. Each manuscript was a relic. To copy one was an act of devotion. In China and Japan, Buddhist libraries adopted local innovations. The invention of woodblock printing in China allowed for the mass production of sutras, and Japan's Ishiyamadera temple became a hub for storing thousands of scrolls. Monks often buried sacred texts in stone containers, sutra mounds, to protect them from war or decay, believing the words would emerge again in a future, more enlightened age. In the Buddhist world, libraries weren't just places, they were acts of compassion. Preserving a text was preserving the Dharma. Shelves were altars. Ink was prayer. These sacred libraries may have been quiet, but their influence resonated across continents, carrying peace, logic, and enlightenment, one manuscript at a time. When we imagine ancient libraries, we often think of scrolls and parchment, temples and marble. But across the oceans, in the Americas, civilizations were building their own repositories of knowledge. Fragile, beautiful, and largely destroyed before they could be studied. What we lost in the Maya, Aztec, and Inca libraries is not just text, it's an entire world view. The Maya were among the most literate pre-Columbian cultures. They developed a complex writing system of glyphs, combining logograms and syllables, used to record astronomy, rituals, history, and cosmology. Their books, known as codices, were made from bark paper covered in white lime and folded like a screen. These codices were painted in vibrant colours, filled with precision and symbolism, and stored in temple vaults and royal libraries. At their peak, the Maya likely possessed hundreds, if not thousands, of codices. But when the Spanish arrived, most were declared heretical and burned by missionaries. The most infamous case was Bishop Diego de Landa, who ordered vast quantities of Maya books destroyed in 1562. He later wrote, "We found a large number of books in these characters, and since they contained nothing in which were not to be seen as superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all." Only 4 Maya codices survive today. The Aztecs too maintained vast archives of amoxtin, books written on deerskin, agave fibers, or bark paper. These included calendars, tribute records, histories, and myths. Scribes known as tlaquilos painted intricate glyphs and symbols using natural pigments, creating living documents that were part sacred, part administrative. These libraries were often housed in royal palaces and temple complexes. The Inca Empire, though lacking a formal writing system, preserved knowledge through quipu, knotted strings used to record numerical data and possibly narrative information. Stored in state archives, these bundles were read by trained officials called quipucamayos and used to manage the vast empire's census, taxes, and military logistics. But the arrival of European conquest brought brutal cultural erasure. Libraries were torched, quipu burned or buried, and entire intellectual traditions silenced within a generation. Unlike Alexandria or Nineveh, there were no great fires we can point to, just waves of colonial policy and missionary zeal that erased centuries of wisdom. The libraries of the Americas didn't just vanish, they were deliberately unremembered. And the silence they left behind still echoes, louder than words. The story of ancient libraries is not just a tale of preservation, it's a tragic chronicle of loss. Ashurbanipal's clay tablets survived only because fire accidentally baked them solid. The scrolls of Alexandria vanished into smoke. The Maya codices were burned by fearful hands. The Buddhist texts of Nalanda turned to ash under invasion. Time, conquest, and neglect conspired again and again to erase what was once considered eternal. It's estimated that more than 90% of ancient literature is lost. Whole genres have disappeared. Comedy plays of the Greeks, engineering manuals of the Romans, medical treatises from India, historical records from the Americas. We have the names of thousands of works, but not the words. Their absence is a void we can still feel. But why did so much vanish? Part of the answer lies in material. Clay cracks, papyrus decays, bamboo molds, parchment burns. Books before printing were delicate, often unique and vulnerable to even mild humidity. One leaky roof could ruin centuries of accumulated thought. War was worse. Invaders didn't just burn libraries, they erased identities. In ancient times, destroying a people's books was as strategic as destroying their armies. The other part of the answer is political. Knowledge is power, and power is selective. When regimes changed, so did the libraries. New rulers purged old ideologies. Heretical scrolls were destroyed, rival authors erased, entire schools of thought lost because they no longer fit the ruling narrative. And yet, fragments remain. Clay shards pulled from ruins, charred scrolls unrolled by modern technology, echoes of lost books quoted in surviving ones, a Roman historian referencing a vanished Greek poet, a Buddhist monk's copy of a manuscript that survived the burning of its original. A Maya glyph scratched into a temple wall no missionary ever found. These scraps are our link to the ancient mind. They remind us that knowledge is never truly safe, but also never entirely gone. Libraries may burn, but ideas migrate. They survive in translation, in memory, in adaptation. Today's digital archives, satellite backups, and global databases are our attempt to defy that long history of loss. But the lesson is still relevant. Preservation is not a one-time act. It's a responsibility. And every time we open a book, ancient or modern, we're helping ensure that memory, once nearly extinguished, continues to burn. Rapa Nui, better known to the outside world as Easter Island, sits in the middle of the South Pacific, over 2,000 miles from the nearest continental shore. Isolated, windswept, and hauntingly quiet, the island measures only about 63 square miles, but it holds one of the greatest enigmas of ancient engineering, the Moai statues. There are nearly 1,000 of them, towering stone figures with heavy brows, long noses, and pursed lips, all standing or fallen across the island. Most face inland, their backs turned to the sea, as though watching over the land. Many are half buried in the earth, their full bodies hidden beneath centuries of soil. Others lie in quarries, partially carved, abandoned mid-creation. Their very presence provokes wonder, awe, and 100 unanswered questions. Why were they built? Who carved them? How were they moved? And why did the people who created them eventually stop? These are the mysteries that have haunted explorers, archaeologists, and storytellers for generations. To outsiders, Easter Island seemed like a riddle frozen in volcanic stone. But to the Rapa Nui people, the island is no mystery at all. It's home. The Moai are not relics of a lost civilization. They are their ancestors. Though the first written accounts came from Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen in 1722, the history of the island stretches back centuries earlier, when Polynesian voyagers, navigating by the stars and waves, first settled this remote paradise. They named it Rapa Nui, meaning Great Rapa, and built a society rooted in deep spiritual tradition, clan identity, and a sacred connection between the living and the dead. The Moai were carved not as idols to be worshipped, but as living vessels of ancestral mana, spiritual energy. Each one represented a deified chief or important ancestor, standing watch over their descendants. The statues weren't just art. They were guardians, mediators between the heavens and the soil. But time, like the sea, is relentless. By the time European sails appeared on the horizon, the island's society had changed. The statues were toppled, the forests were gone, and what remained was a whisper of what once stood tall. And so Rapa Nui became a question mark in stone, its meaning not lost, but buried under centuries of silence. Long before the Moai stood sentry over the island's hills, the land was untouched, lush, forested, and silent, with only the cries of seabirds echoing over its volcanic slopes. Then, sometime between 800 and 1200 CE, a fleet of Polynesian canoes arrived. These voyagers, masters of the ocean, had navigated thousands of miles using nothing but the stars, ocean swells, and the flight patterns of birds. They came from the Marquesas or Mangareva, bringing with them not just people but pigs, chickens, taro, bananas, and sweet potatoes. Everything needed to build a new world. To land on Rapa Nui was to touch the edge of the earth. It is one of the most remote inhabited islands on the planet, and yet these settlers brought with them a fully formed culture, elaborate social structures, oral history, deep spiritual beliefs, and a tradition of monumental stonework. Over time, the island was divided into clans, each controlling different territories, and each anchored by a sacred ancestor figure, an idea that would soon be immortalized in stone. The early Rapa Nui people thrived. Archaeological evidence shows they built villages, cultivated crops in rock gardens to trap moisture, and raised chickens in stone enclosures. Their society was highly organized, ruled by ariki, chiefs, who wielded both political and spiritual authority. Life on the island revolved around the worship of ancestors, who were believed to influence everything from harvests to weather. This ancestral reverence would eventually manifest in the most iconic way possible, the carving of the Moai. It's important to understand that Rapa Nui was not a lost or primitive culture. It was deeply sophisticated, adapted to its harsh and limited environment, and built on a strong sense of continuity between the living and the dead. the settlers brought more than tools. They brought meaning. And it was this spiritual worldview that shaped the decision to begin carving giants. But for now, in these early centuries, the island was in balance. Forests still covered the land. The sea provided fish. The soil was rich. The first Moai were still generations away, but the foundation had been laid both culturally and spiritually for what would become one of the most extraordinary sculptural legacies on Earth. The story had only just begun. At the heart of Rapa Nui's sacred geography lies Rano Raraku, a volcanic crater with steep slopes and soft carvable stone. It was here that the majority of the island's Moai were born, not from legend or myth, but from painstaking craftsmanship. The rock used was volcanic tuff, a compressed ash stone that was relatively soft and ideal for carving, at least in its early stages. Over time, exposure to the elements would harden the statues into their familiar weathered state. Rano Raraku wasn't just a quarry, it was a spiritual workshop, a place of pilgrimage, sweat, and sacred labor. Out of its cliff faces and hillsides, the Rapa Nui sculptors carved hundreds of Moai, some still half-finished, others completed but never transported. Today, nearly 400 statues remain at the site, frozen mid-process like the workers simply vanished. Carving a Moai was not a casual affair. Each statue was commissioned by a clan to honor a specific ancestor, usually a powerful chief. The designs followed a symbolic formula: an elongated face, heavy brow, long ears, and a prominent nose. The body was often barely indicated, with arms pressed against the torso and fingers carved in thin, stylized relief. The Moai ranged in size from modest 6-footers to the colossal El Gigante, an unfinished statue over 70 feet tall and weighing an estimated 150 tons. Carvers used handheld tools made of hard basalt, a much tougher volcanic rock chipped into chisels and axes. The process took months, even years, requiring teams of artisans who passed down their knowledge through generations. As they worked, the Moai remained connected to the rock wall. Only when nearly complete would they be detached, slid downhill, and prepared for transport. What makes Rano Raraku so haunting today is the sheer number of statues still embedded in the earth. Many appear half-buried, but in fact they are full-bodied figures whose lower halves have been swallowed by soil over centuries of erosion. It creates the eerie illusion that the Moai are sinking, when in truth they've been standing patiently, neck-deep in time. This crater was the womb of the island's giants, and it was here that stone and spirit met, where human hands shaped volcanic ash into eternal ancestors. One of the most intriguing features of the Moai is not how they were carved, but where they look. Nearly every Moai statue on Rapa Nui faces inland, away from the ocean. This was no accident. The Moai weren't meant to watch the waves, they were watching the people. Each statue stood on a stone platform called an ahu, a ceremonial site that served both as a foundation and often as a burial place for the individual the Moai represented. These ahu dotted the island's coastlines like spiritual outposts, anchoring each clan's territory and pointing toward the heart of their communities. The Moai, in essence, stood as guardians, embodying powerful ancestors who watched over the villages and offered spiritual protection. To the Rapa Nui people, the Moai were more than sculptures. They were living presences, containers of mana, a sacred energy believed to reside in gods, chiefs, and revered dead. Once erected, a Moai was thought to channel mana into the land, ensuring fertility, good harvests, and the well-being of the clan. They weren't just memorials. They were active participants in daily life, mediators between the spiritual and physical worlds. The Moai's features were intentionally exaggerated to reflect both idealized ancestry and divine authority. The deep-set eyes, high cheekbones, and long noses were visual metaphors for wisdom, strength, and sacred lineage. The long ears may have symbolized the elite class, while the statue's stoic expressions evoked a calm, eternal vigilance. Some Moai were also topped with large red stone topknots called pukao, quarried from a different volcanic site, Puna Pau. These cylinder-shaped additions may have represented hairstyles or ceremonial headdresses, further marking status and reverence. Originally, the statues also had inlaid coral eyes with obsidian or red scoria pupils, giving them a far more lifelike and intense presence than the empty eye sockets seen today. When the eyes were added during ceremonies, the moai were said to see for the first time, transforming from stone to sacred. The inland gaze of the moai reveals the heart of Rapa Nui spirituality. These statues were never built for outsiders. They were built for the people, facing their descendants, silently watching generation after generation come and go, immovable, unblinking, eternal. How do you move a 30-foot, 80-ton stone statue without wheels, cranes, or metal tools across miles of rough terrain? For centuries, this was the great riddle of Rapa Nui. The island's moai are scattered across vast distances, with many placed on stone ahu platforms far from the quarry at Rano Raraku. Early theories included dragging them on wooden sledges or rolling them on logs, ideas that raised even more questions, especially considering the island's severe deforestation. Others, more fanciful, suggested alien intervention or levitation through spiritual power. But the true answer may lie in the island's own oral history. According to Rapa Nui legend, the moai walked to their destinations. At first glance, this sounds like myth, but in recent years, researchers have taken this idea literally and successfully. In 2012, archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo conducted a remarkable experiment. Using ropes and teams of people positioned on each side of a replica moai, they managed to rock the statue forward in a controlled, upright manner, like shimmying a heavy refrigerator. The key was balance, rhythm, and coordination. In this way, the moai could have been transported standing up, just as the legends described. No logs, no dragging, no science fiction, just human ingenuity and tradition. The base of many moai also supports this theory. They have curved bottoms, flat in back, rounded in front, suggesting they were designed to tilt and pivot forward, not lie down. This movement method would have required large teams, ropes made of plant fibre, and most of all, faith. In Rapa Nui spirituality, the power to move the moai was attributed to mana, the sacred energy of the ancestors. Chiefs and priests were believed to command this spiritual force, which could animate the statues during rituals. So while engineers see physics, the Rapa Nui saw the divine at work. In truth, both were right. Transporting moai was not merely an engineering challenge, it was a ceremonial act, a public performance of unity, devotion, and ancestral connection. The moai didn't move by magic. They moved because people believed they had to. And in that belief, Rapa Nui's greatest engineering marvel was not stone, it was human cooperation driven by spiritual purpose. As centuries passed, the building of moai didn't slow down, it accelerated. The early harmony of Rapa Nui's clans gave way to increasing rivalry, as each group sought to honour its ancestors with larger, more imposing statues. What began as spiritual tribute gradually evolved into a competitive tradition of monumental pride. Clans vied for dominance not through warfare, but through stone craftsmanship. Bigger moai meant more mana, more prestige, and a stronger claim to ancestral power. Each clan sought to outdo the others, erecting taller statues, adding new features, and developing more elaborate ceremonial platforms. The race wasn't just about size, it was about spiritual superiority. This competition led to significant innovations. The introduction of pukau, large red stone topknots carved from the volcanic stone at Punapau, added both height and symbolic weight. These topknots, some weighing up to 12 tons, may have represented hairstyles worn by high-ranking chiefs or sacred headdresses, visual reminders of divine favour. Moai design also evolved. Early statues were relatively short and wide, but over time they grew slimmer, more angular, and dramatically taller. Some of the later moai exceeded 30 feet in height, towering over villages like ancestral titans. But this escalation came at a cost. To support the growing construction efforts, the island's forests were cut down, timber possibly used for food cultivation, fuel, building canoes, and, according to older theories, statue transportation. As tree cover vanished, soil erosion worsened, agricultural yields declined, and freshwater sources became harder to manage. The very resources that supported the Moai culture were slowly being exhausted, and yet the people didn't stop. Instead, they carved more statues, larger ones. They dug deeper into spiritual traditions, hoping the ancestors would restore balance. But the balance was already tipping. As the island's ecology deteriorated, tensions between clans began to simmer. Competition turned to resentment. The collaborative spirit that had once moved giants was cracking under the strain of survival. The golden age of Moai building had become a burden, but to stop building was unthinkable. The Moai were more than symbols. They were the heartbeat of Rapa Nui's identity. So the islanders continued, carving devotion from stone, even as the earth beneath them thinned. A spiritual arms race was underway, and no one could afford to lose. By the 17th century, the unthinkable had happened. Rapa Nui was unraveling. The very system that had once unified the island, ancestor worship through Moai construction, had pushed its resources to the breaking point. The forests were gone. Without trees, there were no canoes for deep-sea fishing, no wood to build or cook, and no shelter from the island's harsh sun and winds. The rich volcanic soil, once protected by roots and shade, had eroded. Crops withered. Fresh water became scarce. And yet, even as survival became difficult, the statues kept coming. Larger, more elaborate, more demanding of labor. The spiritual engine of the island had no brakes, but soon the people did something drastic. They stopped erecting the Moai. Some statues were abandoned mid-transport, left lying along ancient roads like forgotten giants. Others were half-finished at the quarry, their chisels frozen in time. The spiritual arms race had reached its limit. The ancestors could no longer provide what the earth could not sustain. Then came the topplings. Archaeological evidence shows that, beginning in the late 1600s, Moai across the island were deliberately pushed over, their necks snapped, their faces shattered. This wasn't the work of nature, it was human conflict. Clans began warring over land, water, and prestige. The very statues that once embodied unity became targets of revenge and rage. Oral traditions describe this period as the rise of the Huri Moai, the time of statue toppling. With faith in the Moai system collapsing, power shifted toward a new spiritual political order. The Birdman cult, which emphasized agility, competition, and ritual warfare over ancestral mana. This cultural upheaval marked the end of an era. By the time the first European visitors arrived in 1722, they found an island society vastly different from the one that had carved the Moai. None of the statues were standing on their platforms. The once vibrant spiritual system was broken, and the people were struggling to survive in a deforested, divided land. The downfall of Rapa Nui wasn't caused by a single event. It was a slow-motion collapse, triggered by environmental exhaustion, social competition, and a spiritual system that couldn't adapt quickly enough. What remained were toppled gods in stone, staring up at the sky, as if asking how it all went wrong. When Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Sunday in 1722, he found a society that had already endured collapse. The Moai stood toppled. The forests were gone. The Rapa Nui people were few in number, thin, wary, and weathered by generations of hardship. Roggeveen's men noted the statues and the barren landscape, but failed to understand the civilization that had created them. And then the outsiders kept coming. Over the next 2 centuries, European contact brought devastation to Rapa Nui. Whalers, missionaries, traders, and slavers arrived, each leaving their own mark, and most of them erasing more than they recorded. In 1862, Peruvian slave raiders kidnapped nearly 1,500 Rapa Nui people, including the high chiefs and scribes. only a handful ever returned. Along with them came smallpox, which spread like fire among the survivors. Worse still was the arrival of Christian missionaries who sought to civilize the islanders. They banned traditional rituals, destroyed sacred carvings, and forced conversions, often replacing Moai-centered spiritual life with imported European practices. The oral traditions that had preserved the island's history for centuries were suppressed, and a written language, Rongorongo, possibly the only indigenous script in Oceania, was all but lost. By the late 19th century, the island's population had fallen to just over 100 people. Colonial powers carved up Rapa Nui's land and leased it as sheep pasture, fencing off ancestral sites and confining the Rapa Nui people to a small corner of the island. Even their ability to access the Moai was restricted. The statues, once living symbols of family and power, became silent monuments, neglected, looted, or treated as curiosities for foreign explorers and collectors. European archaeologists removed statues, ceremonial items, and even human remains, shipping them to museums in London, Paris, and Santiago. Some Moai were cut at the base and taken whole, now displayed thousands of miles from their sacred homes. The island had become a case study in cultural erasure, but the Rapa Nui people never forgot who they were. Even in forced silence, they carried the memory of the Moai. The traditions endured, hidden, whispered, passed down in fragments, and slowly, over the centuries, the people would begin to reclaim the stories carved in stone. But first, the world had to learn to listen. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Rapa Nui began a slow but determined process of cultural revival and reclamation. The Moai, once toppled and buried by time, conflict, and neglect, were gradually raised again, this time not just as monuments of the past, but as symbols of resilience. In the 1950s, famed Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl brought international attention to Easter Island. Though many of his theories were flawed, especially his ideas about South American influence, his work helped spark archaeological interest and global curiosity. Researchers from around the world descended upon the island, not to plunder as before, but to study and restore. Restoration efforts began in earnest. Fallen Moai were re-erected on their ahu platforms. Coral eyes were reconstructed. Pukao topknots were returned. The island's ancient roads, quarries, and ceremonial sites were mapped and studied. A clearer picture of the Rapa Nui civilization began to emerge, not one of mystery, but of engineering brilliance, spiritual depth, and cultural complexity. But the most important voices were no longer those of foreign scholars. They were the Rapa Nui people themselves. Descendants of the original builders began reclaiming their language, rituals, and land rights. In 2017, Chile formally transferred control of Rapa Nui National Park, which includes most of the island's archaeological sites, back to the Rapa Nui community. Now, locals oversee the Moai and their care, and decisions about excavation and preservation are made with cultural sensitivity and ancestral knowledge. New generations are learning the stories of their ancestors, not just from textbooks, but from elders, chants, dances, and the Moai themselves. Efforts to decipher Rongorongo, the island's mysterious script, continue with cautious optimism. And global institutions, including the British Museum and the Louvre, face increasing pressure to return Moai and sacred artifacts taken during the colonial period. Today, Rapa Nui stands at a crossroads between memory and modernity. Tourists arrive in waves, and economic development brings both opportunity and risk. Yet the people continue to protect their heritage, not as a frozen relic, but as a living tradition. The Moai no longer serve as silent guardians over a lost world. They now bear witness to survival, to a culture that endured collapse, colonization, and erasure, and still found a way to rise again. Stone cracked, forests burned, voices silenced, but the ancestors still stand.